Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Iran's foreign minister is visiting the UN in New York with the nuclear deal and the Gulf diplomatic crisis toppling the agenda. Can Iran's envoy win friends in a challenging environment? China's 5th National Financial Work Conference has established a super-regulator. Will this move ensure that the financial sector serves the real economy? And we start today's program in the U.S. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif is visiting the U.S. despite its intense ties with the Trump administration. Prior to this visit, Iran has repeatedly urged the United States to comply with the requirements of the comprehensive agreement to lift sanctions against Iran. And given the regional crisis that is going on right now, it's worth seeing how things will play out between Iran and the U.S.
Zarif arrived in New York on July 13th to attend the United Nations high-level political forum and speak with representatives of various countries. It happens just after U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's 4-day visit to the Middle East on the 11th of July. His trip aimed to find a solution to the crisis over the sanctions imposed on Qatar by Saudi Arabia and its allies.
I appreciate the joint interest that we share, our two countries, our mutual interest here in terms of security, stability for the region, and economic prosperity for the region as well. It's a very important, strong partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia.
The four countries led by Saudi Arabia severed ties with Qatar last month, accusing it of financing extremist groups and aligning with the Gulf Arab state's arch-foe, Iran. Doha denies those accusations. The Middle East crisis made the U.S. worry about its military's regional goals and the increase of Iran's influence in the Middle East. The Iranian nuclear issue is also the topic of this visit. Iran and 6 other countries in July 2015 reached a comprehensive agreement on the Iran nuclear issue. Under the agreement, Iran will limit its nuclear program. In exchange, the international community will lift long-term sanctions against Iran. But U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly criticized the agreement during the presidential campaign, calling it one of the worst deals in history, and said he would recertify the agreement and resume negotiations. Against Trump's stance towards Iran, Zarif made his comments. Look at ISIS, look at al-Nusra, look at al-Qaeda, look at other terrorist organizations. None of them have anything to do with Iran, and all of them receive not only their ideology, but their financial assistance, their weapons, their arms from others who call themselves U.S. allies. The Middle East has long been the strategic focus of the U.S., and now even its most stable nations face a crisis. Major powers including the U.S., France, and Iran are trying their best to mediate. How will the situation develop remains to be seen.
So what is likely to be achieved or not? To answer those questions, I'm joined here in the Beijing studio, Mr. Li Guofu, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir, to our program. Joining us in Tehran, Iran, we invited Mohammad Marandi, Professor and Dean of the World Faculty Studies at the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, what a pleasure to have you. Also joining us in Boston, U.S., Jim Walsh, who is with the Security Studies Program of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Welcome as well, Mr. Walsh. I want to begin with Professor Marandi. A lot of things going on. There is the issue between Iran, the United States, the nuclear program, and also the regional conflict, as well as the U.S. On the immigration bill. A lot of things. What is likely to be the focus this time, Professor Marandi?
As you point out, there's a lot going on. I think perhaps for the Iranians, the most important issues are U.S. support for extremists in the region, meaning that the United States is supporting efforts being made by the Saudis, the Israeli regime, as well as the Turkish government to continue supporting al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda affiliates, meaning the Nusra Front among others. But also, in addition to that, I think the Iranians feel that the United States is moving away, further away from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The belief in Tehran is that under President Obama, the United States gradually began to violate the agreement increasingly as time went by, and Congress as well as the Senate passed laws that were in conflict with the agreement. But after Trump, there has been an escalation of sorts.
I see.
And right now we see that Congress and Senate and the U.S. Senate are on the verge of passing new sanctions against Iran, and President Trump has been calling on countries not to do trade with Iran, which, as the Iranian foreign minister pointed out, is explicitly it contravenes, it contradicts the text of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
All right. Mr. Walsh, I want you to respond to that. Two issues. One is the Iranians' so-called concern of U.S. relations with the regional power in the Middle East, particularly Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and some of the others. The second, of course, is a nuclear issue. Let's begin with the regional powers.
Yeah, I actually agree with my colleague that that's the more central issue right now. There are the two issues, and they are functioning largely in different categories. But the real change in U.S. policy, a dramatic change in U.S. policy, has been a real tilt towards Saudi Arabia. And you saw that in President Trump's summit with the Gulf cooperation states, his backing of the war in Yemen, and then most recently and strangely, his tweets regarding Qatar and Saudi Arabia, because now there's a fight within the GCC community between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And he backed, even though the U.S. has a giant base in Qatar, he backed the Saudi view on this. And so there does seem to be a real tilt in U.S. relations. And of course, Saudi Arabia and Iran are in the middle of this very ugly, deep rivalry. So the U.S. sort of taking one side here, I think, has made the region more tense.
Right.
And then separately, the nuclear issue. You know, I don't think anyone's violated the deal yet, but I do think it's on more uncertain territory as the overall relationship grows more uncertain. But I think the Iranians see that the Iran nuclear agreement is in their self-interest. They're benefiting from their trade with China and India and Europe, and they're not going to look to tear it up. And the U.S. continues to certify sanctions waivers, so it's sort of a bumpy process. But it's continued so far, and I expect it will continue in the future.
Very interesting views from both sides. Let's go to Mr. Li here in Beijing. Of course, you are looking from outside toward that direction. First of all, after the Iraq War, more than 10 years ago, there has been gradual gaining ground of Iran in the region as a result of this very ugly war. So how much will this so-called walk away from the earlier balance set up by the Obama administration, now Trump going to have a very different approach, likely to change that picture much?
I think, as you said, that after the Iraqi war, and you see that, the American war on terror in the region has dramatically, changed the balance of power in the whole Middle East, and Iran rising to be a major regional powers. And during the Obama, because of his retrenchment with Iran, because of the nuclear deal, Iran the influence get much more. And the U.S. President Trump tried to reverse this kind of trend, and Trump to realign or strengthening its traditional alliance in the Middle East.
Right.
And this is trying to neutralize the expansion and the influence of Iran.
But the question is, will it be done?
And it will be very, very hard. You can see, I agree with my American friends said, because of the Trump's policies, there'll be more, tensions, there'll be more unstabilized kind of situation in the Middle East.
Right. What about the nuclear deal? Of course, the Iranian foreign minister, before going to New York, had been accusing of the U.S. side of violating the deal and also urging Trump to come and go align with what has been earlier agreed. But this is a new administration. President Trump did things very differently from his predecessor. So will these kinds of trades of words, accusations, work eventually for the two sides to seek a solution?
I think, it will be very, very difficult for the two sides to seek the solutions. And the best that we would hope is that, they are only in a trade of war of words, no actions. Because, the nuclear deal is so much important, not only for the both countries, also for the world.
That's right. As you said, it is not a deal just between Iran and the United States, but rather Iran with many of the global powers, including the Europeans. Mr. Walsh, therefore, the U.S., some say, and Europe is in a collision over the issue of the Iran nuclear deal. Remember, the European Union was a big player in reaching this deal. And we don't see these days a beautiful honeymoon days between the United States and its European allies to begin with. So will this further escalate the kinds of differences, divergence between the two sides? This is not just Iran and U.S., but rather much more complicated than this.
Yeah. Well, the JCPOA is an international agreement backed by a UN Security Council resolution. It is not a bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Iran, so you're absolutely right. I think if push came to shove, and I agree with my Chinese colleague, I hope that this just continues in the theater of words and doesn't start to, turn into real actions. For example, I hope that neither side is going to file formal complaints about the others at the Commission, at the Agreement Commission. I think that would be a mistake, and that could have unintended consequences. But to your point, it's an international agreement. I think the Europeans would back, if the U.S. sort of went in there and tears it up, I think the Europeans are going to stick with the agreement. I will say, though, based on recent conversations, that I expect the British, who are having their problems with the EU, may very well follow the U.S. on this.
I see.
So I think you're really talking about a fracturing of the European point of view. Let me finally add quickly, Tian, because I thought your question was a good one, that the balance of power did change after the war in Iraq. I think you're absolutely right. It took Iraq off the table, and that changed the regional dynamics. I think Iran has always been an important player in the region. It's always going to be an important player because of its oil and its size and its differences. But I think there's some talk in the U.S. and elsewhere that overestimates Iran's rise as this gigantic menace. I think they do have more influence in Iraq today than they did in past years, but the future of that's unclear.
Right.
And militarily, they are not the top-ranked country.
Okay.
Top-ranked countries are Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. So I would say let's keep this somewhat in perspective.
All right, then. Let's also keep it in perspective when it comes to the Iranian nuclear deal. Professor Morandi, we earlier talking about, the very complicated bilateral, multilateral relationship as a result of this deal. But within Iran, there are a lot of things going on as well, because you do see divisions among different factors in Iran. Their attitude still toward this deal is different. And today we heard about the arrest of the brother of the current president, who is believed by many as a reformer kind of person inside your country. And we all know the foreign minister is being labeled as that as well. So the question is, when you have oppositions from outside and not try to follow up with the deal, within your country, is it likely to be more fractions as well? And how complicated will that make things, both inside your country and also regionally? Professor Morandi, it's a long question, but this is an important question.
Well, I would disagree in the sense that there are no real differences in Iran among mainstream politicians with regards to the JCPOA. Everyone believes that Iran should stick with the agreement. There are those who think that it's a good agreement. There are those who think that it's not a great agreement. But everyone believes that it has been agreed upon, and Iran will abide by its commitments. The issue with regards to the financial allegations against the brother of the president really have nothing to do with this. So it is not going to be Iran that tears up the agreement. The Iranians will only end the agreement if the United States does so first. If the United States wishes to exit the agreement, then the Iranians will believe that then there's no purpose in pursuing it. But I think
Professor
that,
Morandi, may I just try to confirm with you what you just said? Are you suggesting if the U.S. walk away from this deal, which Iran reached with multilateral players, that Iran will also walk away, despite of its deal with other players as well? Is that what you're suggesting?
If the U.S. Tears up the agreement, then ultimately what happens is that the end game becomes unclear, because after a certain number of years, the situation with the Iranian nuclear program must become like every other country. In other words, all the permanent UN resolutions that have been put on hold, their status will be unclear. So if the United States exits the agreement, then I think that it's quite possible that the Iranians will see that it's useless. But at the moment, I don't think that the United States wishes to do so.
Right.
The United States is violating the agreement. I disagree with your good guess there. The very fact that Trump has tried to prevent Iran's trade from normalizing itself is explicitly in violation of the agreement.
Yeah.
But I think that what has changed is that the United States is much more isolated today partially because of Trump's policies. The Europeans are not happy with what Trump is doing, the Chinese, the Russians, and by and large the international community has many problems with the United States. So it is more difficult for Trump to create a coalition against Iran. I agree with the issue about Britain, but then again, the current British government is a weak government. The opposition, the Labour Party, has a very different policy, actually, when it comes to Iran. And the balance of power in the region has changed. I, of course, disagree. Israel is not a powerful country. It's only it's because of U.S. support that it's able to maintain the status quo. And the Saudi regime is very weak. We've seen it lose a war in Yemen. So Iran and its allies are much more powerful today than before. Iraq is a friend of Iran. Iraq is becoming much more powerful. Syria is stabilizing. The Saudis have lost the war in Yemen. The Saudis have basically lost its battle with Qatar, which is one of the strangest things that we've been seeing in recent
Professor Morandi,
years.
here's one
Wahhabi, the Saudis can't tolerate the Wahhabis. So Saudi Arabia is in a weak position at the moment.
All right. There is a crucial question that I really need to ask you about this, which is when it comes to this kind of deal between Iran and the international community, how much can Iran exert pressure on Washington now, and skills and strategies now, so that Washington, even under the Trump administration, would be able to a certain extent, still follow up on that deal? Today, Professor Morandi, we have heard the news that a Chinese-American young man, graduate student supposed to be, has been arrested by Iran and put in charge of 10 years in prison. But of course, those are just one of those things that happen. But the thing is, will pressure like this from Iran likely to make Washington think twice about its walking away from the deal? What kinds of things Iran can still do, Tehran today, to make Washington come back to the original deal? Professor Morandi, do you think there's remedy?
Well, with regards to the individual who was arrested on espionage, I think that has nothing to do with Iran-U.S. relations in the sense that he was not arrested to put pressure on Washington. Every time that someone is arrested in Iran and charged with espionage, the United States will always deny it and say that they're innocent. Yet, and the Western media will abide by the policies of the U.S. government. Yet we have many Iranians in the United States who've been arrested over the past couple of decades, as well as Lebanese and others who really have been in prison. I know a couple of them personally, And no one says anything about that. The problem between Iran and the United States goes back to two issues. One is that the Iranians believe that the United States does not want to allow the JCPOA to function as it was supposed to on the day of the agreement. The second issue, as I said earlier, is what Iran sees as U.S. continued support for extremism. Wahhabism, which is being exported by Saudi Arabia, has become a global menace. And ever since the fallout between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, we see that the Saudis and the Qataris and others, and even Western countries, are speaking more about what the Saudis have been doing to spread extremism. So Trump's support for Saudi Arabia is ironic in this regard.
Let's go to Mr. Washer, because I need to have a balance of time for among all the guests. It's not that anyone do not disagree with you, but rather a balance of time. Mr. Walsh, respond to what Professor Morandi just said. Secondly, what is going to mean for Washington if the Trump administration really walk away from this deal, this nuclear deal between the international community and Iran? Will that be another layer of, shall I say, disgrace, at least from the outside, after the U.S. Apparent withdrawal from the climate agreement?
Yeah. Well, let's say several things. One, I do have questions about this arrest of this Chinese-American graduate student. It certainly doesn't have the look and feel of an intelligence operation. And I have had friends in Evin prison who have been released, and others. And I think if anyone's been arrested anywhere on the wrong charges, they should be released. But I do have concern there. As for the future of the JCPOA, I think we're more in a, rather than having remedies to the problem, I think for the next short term and medium term, we're more in a defensive mode. That is to say, of sort of preserving and holding on to what we have as we get through this stormy period. And so I don't see any remedies. I'm afraid certainly the U.S.-Saudi relationship is not going to suddenly reverts itself in the next 6 months. Although with Mr. Trump, all things are possible. That's probably not going to happen. So I think that we'll see continued tension in the U.S.-Iranian relationship, unfortunately. And that the goal here will be to sort of just, despite the noise, stick with the agreement. And then if he does, but I agree that your final question is what happens if he pulls out. I think it is possible. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's possible, and it may depend on things that happen domestically here in the U.S., whether he's feeling under siege or not. And I would say the climate thing is big. You're right to put your finger on it, but he could pull out of that without destroying the whole thing. This would be different. I think the Iran agreement would be a different challenge.
Before we go, I need to have Mr. Li, also here in Beijing, to say a few words. Of course, things are very fluid at this time. It depends on all the domestic politics in the two countries that we talk about, and also what's going on there in the region. So, Mr. Li, some final words and thoughts from you as well.
I think, because, the nuclear deal at this moment not only serve the interests of the United States, the Iran, and as well as, the international community. And so I believe that, this is an international and the community approve the deal. So either sides, or the U.S. or Iran, if they walk our way, but international community would not allow them to do that.
Well, with the DPRK nuclear issue that is also still hanging in the air, many are looking at the Iranian nuclear deal to see whether it's a solution that can be followed. We'll see how things are evolving from here. For now, I want to thank the three of you, all of you gentlemen, for being with us. Li Guofu, Mohammed Morandi, Jim Walsh. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you from Beijing. Still to come on our program, China's 5th National Financial Work Conference has established a super regulator. Will this move ensure that the financial sector benefits the real economy? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tianwei, coming to you live from Beijing. Next, we take a look at China's new move on securing its financial system. Chinese President Xi Jinping has ordered the establishment of a super-regulator to coordinate the supervision and management of financial stability. This came at the National Financial Work Conference held in Beijing over the weekend. The new move has triggered wide discussion on the current challenges and solutions to China's financial market.
Another regulator set to stabilize China's financial system. The new body, named the Financial Stability Development Committee, will coordinate between the regulators of banking, securities and insurance. Meanwhile, the central bank will be imbued with powers to assume a bigger role in curbing risks. The move is seen by many as an action to mend the country's fragmented regulatory structure.
We've seen an outflow of capital. This is not to be overlooked because it will have an adverse impact on the real economy, which needs a lot of capital support. Under the previous joint supervision system, no one particular regulator would bear responsibility for capital outflows. Now the new committee will clearly indicate who is responsible for managing such capital flight.
President Xi said the purpose of financial management is to prevent systemic risks. During the conference, he said financial work should stay true to its original purpose, which is to serve the country's social-economic development, especially the real economy. Second, the structure of China's financial system, including its markets, organizations and products, must be optimized. Third, regulators must strengthen supervision method and enhance capability to prevent and resolve financial risks. In terms of market orientation, the market should always play a decisive role in the distribution of financial resources. China's new economic figures show positive signs, with growth rate of first half of 2017 reaching 6.9%, higher than international expectations. Yet, challenges in the financial market, such as rising debt and high leverage, remain to be threats to China's financial security. China will have to strike a balance between economic growth and financial security.
And for more on the Financial National Conference, I'm joined here in Beijing by two panelists, Xu Sitao, Chief Economist of Deloitte China. Also here we have Xiao Geng, Professor of Finance and Public Policy at Hong Kong University. And also in New York, the U.S., we have William Hess, Head of Research with PRC Marco. It's good to see you, Mr. Hess. Long time no see. It's great to have all the three of you as well. I want to begin with the two guests here in Beijing. So, what is this super regulator going to be about? We know we have a central bank. We have three commissions on the securities, the insurance, and also banking. So, how is this super regulator going to function? Do we know, Mr. Xu?
I think the rationale is to improve coordination so that if we have next financial jitters or crisis, then all the regulatory bodies can work together. But in order to do that, you need to have a super agency in charge.
All right. How will this super agency function? Will that be the cabinet level, as they say, or is it going to be more with the People's Bank of China, which is the central bank here in this country?
Well, I think this is unique for China. The State Council is essentially necessary in the completing the task of financial stability, because a lot of problems comes from the local government and also state-owned enterprises, and they are much more powerful than in other countries. So that's why they have this so-called super regulator, but actually this is a State Council Financial Stability and Development Board, very much like National Development Reform Commission, which is for the real sector. For the financial sector, for China's unique situations, we need such thing like this one.
Mr. Xu, do you like that comparison?
Not exactly, because if we recall what happened a few years ago in the stock market,
that's right.
A mini crisis actually was getting worse. To a large extent, that has to do with a poor coordination between various regulatory bodies.
Or among them.
Yes, there were 3 of them. So I think the rationale of creating this agency is not about dealing with the real economy, whether it's local government debt or SOEs. It's about preventing systemic risk.
Okay, we don't know the details yet. That is why we can debate about it, because I guess there are a lot of ideas popping up at this point as to how things should be done. Mr. Hess, you've been a long-time China hand, I would say, even young in age, but what do you make of this new move, or at least new idea? How is this likely to compare China's earlier history of having regulators? And how is this likely to compare, let's just say, your system back in the United States?
I think it's an important question. And one thing I would mention, though, that even before this latest working conference, the central bank was given authority to create a unified database of financial information. So one of the issues of coordination is that there's not good data sharing between the agencies. So the banking regulator doesn't know what's happening in the securities front with risks that might flow back to the banking sector. The same goes with insurance, and that's an important step. So to get the coordination moving. But I think it's always difficult if you're taking agencies that aren't working well together and then put another agency on top of them. Historically the experience has been mixed, where it doesn't necessarily make them cooperate better, it just adds a layer of bureaucracy and reporting. So I think we'll really have to see how it plays out and make sure that the flows, especially of information and data between agencies, to get back to the central bank, and so those with the authority to really coordinate regulation have the best information to do so.
Right. Well, Mr. Xiao, Professor, even right after this news was coming out, people began to talk about that and discuss it, and they say, well, the cabinet is regulated it anyway, because all of these central bank and also the 3 regulatory commissions, they go to the State Council to have meetings anyway. So it's happening there. So now what is happening is just to have a name of the earlier mechanism and establish it as a platform rather than the earlier casual way of putting it together. So Professor Xiao, what do you make of this comparison? Is that the rationale?
Well, I think the key here is that there are a lot of financial regulatory arbitrage, and basically means that some new sectors, emerging, you don't have regulation there yet, but then the market is already so powerful, and a lot of speculations and all these kind of things happening. So in a way, the reason I compare to NDRC is because you really need reform, and you also need the development. So it's a learning process. It's a try and error, and then you need to create new institutions to plug the holes, in a regulation. So that's why that kind of task is not like some super regulator, in the West. It's really institutional building and try and error process.
Right. The reason why we talk about this is not just for the sake of the so-called super regulator. It's really about how much risk has there been in the Chinese financial sector and system, and how much risk will there be continuously for the future, and how to find solutions to make things much less risky than it used to be. So here's the thing, Mr. Xu, from your perspective, what are some of the areas that are most risky, let's just say, within the financial systems? Have this national work conference, which is held only 5 years, only once every 5 years, address that? Remember, there's one word used in the document, it's called eternal. Eternal solution has to be sought in order to avoid the financial risks. So what is it?
Well, I think, Tianwei, you have asked 2 questions. One question is, what's a major risk? I think the major risk right now is being commonly identified as a leverage in corporate sector. I think that's the biggest source of risk in the medium term, not in the short term yet. Now, the super agency, whether that's going to be a solution, I suspect not. The solution to leverage is going to be slower economic growth rate and continued reform, particular state-owned sector. But the purpose of this agency is to prevent the repeat of what happened in stock market in 2015. I think that risk could be mitigated a few years ago.
Okay, things to talk about the leverage ratio risks. Let's take a look at some of the numbers that we still got for our audience. Take a look at these. Leverage ratios of major economies, according to the Bank of International Settlements, up to late September of 2016, China's overall leverage ratio is about 255%, while the US is 0.1% higher than that of China. UK with over 280%, Japan over 370%, while the average ratio of developed economies is around 280, which is higher than China. Of course, China now regards itself still as a developing economy. So whether we could use that number to judge whether China is safer or riskier than the others is questionable. But let me go to you, Mr. Hess. What about that? Where is the risk? Are we finding solutions for that risk, Mr. Hess?
For solutions, I think not yet, but I guess the real risk is in the pace of change, whether it's the pace of growth or the pace of deceleration. So you saw in the U.S. after the crisis that there was pretty rapid deleveraging of the corporate sector. And so the U.S. in some ways is hard to compare because the U.S. is has global capital markets. China is still relatively closed in that sense. But really the pace of change is really the key risk, and that really draws out all of the contingent risks about who's guaranteed whose debt, and if local governments have guarantees that aren't valid. I mean, these are all things that act like kind of accelerators when those risks materialize.
I see. But Professor Xiao, this is China. I mean, the pace of change is vast compared to all the other economies in the world almost. Of course, it's slowing down, but only to a certain extent. China has to guarantee the employment rate as well. So, Mr. Xiao, is this going to work? Given the fact that we are still developing on a really fast pace, is this going to be part of the nature of that fast-paced development?
If you based on the track record, I think this time it will work again. Large because you can see that most of the risks has been exposed, either in the stock market, the debt market, exchange market, or property market, and now also the loopholes also are exposed. So if China can plug those holes. And then the real sector can really get a push, by financial opening and all those things which we need to do.
Talking about the real sector, there is the priority, right, set by this national conference, 3 priorities. The very first priority is to serve the real economy. But Mr. Xu, what is the real economy? That's a question mark, isn't it? I mean, is it about traditional industrial sector, or is it about those sectors combined with the new economy? We all know the BATs, the unicorns in China, now also developing banking sector, particularly when it comes to inclusive kinds of banking styles. But now the 4 commercial banks, they also have these inclusive banking departments as well. So what is likely to be the competition, coordination, cooperation among all of these? What is the real picture here?
Well, the real picture is that the real economy is everything, including what you have talked about a minute ago. So
did I cover everything? All right.
Pretty much. But for so-called traditional old economy, so for example, steel sector, shipping sector, cement, we need to accept the reality. Many of the sectors, they must be shrunk. Now, in the new economy, explosive growth is likely to continue. So the best case scenario is the continued growth of the new economy would cushion the pain of the consolidation in the real economy, old economy.
Interesting point there. Mr. Hess, do you agree with that? Even though I know there are many who would not agree necessarily with what Mr. Xu just said.
I think I would, and it's also about risk has to be priced properly. It's not just about controlling risk and controlling defaults. It's making sure that risk is priced properly so those lending to corporations and to others get an adequate return based on that risk. And then when those risks materialize, that the markets can process it, meaning write-downs, write-offs, bankruptcies, NPLs. And so I think the real substance of the working conference will not be known for a while. Typically, if you look back at, say, 1997, for example, it took a couple of years before the documents that were really drafted at the 1997 conference were released, and that led to dealing with NPLs and recapitalization of the bank. So I think there's much more to come from the conference, not just about the regulator, but really about redefining risk as dealing with the risky assets. And I think there are a lot of those sitting on bank balance sheets.
I see. We're going to have 1 minute left for you, Professor Xiao. What about that? I mean, the so-called serve the real economy. What is it going to be about? And how is it going to be served?
Well, the key is to really channel savings to the most productive real projects instead of speculation or the third party or those shadow banking activities.
As simple as that.
Yeah.
I'm sure those words are going to create some further debates, but we are running out of time, gentlemen, for now. With the details of how to do and what to do coming out, we are going to have further debates about all of them. Thank you so much for being with us. Xu Sidao, Xiao Geng, William Hess, thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for insights across China and around the world. Good night.